Greetings everyone, Remarkable Republican here once again to bring you the truth with a truth-flavored bias. Today we're taking a look at the top 10 movies of the 2010s. So what shaped the 2010s? What made this decade distinctive? What is the backdrop of all of these movies? The backdrop is political. The 2010s were the hardest time in American political history. Starting out the decade, we had the worst president in American history with one of the worst economies in American history. A lot of people were struggling economically, there was a lot of anger, and it was just not a pretty place. And even when Trump emerged as a savior after the Obama years, a lot of people on the Democratic side who had been supporters of Obama's cult were really fired up and kept attacking Trump as a foreign agent and all that kind of stuff. And it's just been an ugly, ugly decade, mostly because of people on the left. And now that we're heading into a new decade, I have high hopes that things will calm down and we'll have a better decade. It's pretty clear Trump will win re-election, and I think that he will usher us into a new age of prosperity and civility. He will be the next Reagan, in other words. Reagan also apparently had a few bumps in the road early on. So I think that Trump is still on a Reagan course. Anyway, here are the top movies when we keep this backdrop in mind. People were looking for something as an escape, a sort of delivery from evil. And I think that explains why the 2010s were massively dominated by remakes, which are callbacks to previous times, and also dominated by superhero movies, people who can save you from this horrible horror that we see in the 2010s. Honorable mentions. Let's look at the movies which were really, really good but weren't quite top 10 for the decade as a whole. Up first, we have Total Recall and Red Dawn. These are remakes of 80s movies, and they improve upon the originals in every way. They're exactly what remakes should strive to be. However, they didn't really break into the consciousness of Americans the way that other movies did. So they were really good, but most likely they will be forgotten over time, unfortunately. Jurassic World and Jurassic World 2 really revived the Jurassic Park franchise. These are some of the best dinosaur-based movies in a long time. A similar movie is The Meg. This is about the Meg shark, which was a very large shark that lived in the past. This is a really good and underrated movie, but it is something that was largely taken as a joke because people didn't understand that it was supposed to be kind of a parody of Jaws and that it is something of a comedy. But like I said, this decade didn't do comedy super well because a lot of people were very sensitive and butthurty, so not many people got the joke. There's also Batman vs. Superman. That was a really good action movie which showed the kind of petty human side and failings of each of these heroes. Dark Knight Rises was the conclusion to the Christopher Nolan Batman series. It's a pretty good movie. I'd say the second best in the series. The first best, of course, was Batman Begins. Dark Knight Rises, the highlight is when Batman and the police retake the city. It was kind of like this way to show that the police need to keep order and not allow the kind of riots we saw with Occupy Wall Street and all of that. So good movie, but I think that people have already forgotten about the context enough that it doesn't really have the same kind of power. If you look at 300 Rise of an Empire, it's good, but it doesn't really do anything that 300 hadn't already done. Skyfall, very good James Bond movie, kind of dark, gritty, also a little bit depressing, establishes the character more, and just altogether a great experience, but not terribly uplifting. Taken 3, the final chapter of the Taken trilogy, really does a good job. X-Men First Class, The Wolverine, X-Men Days of Future Past, X-Men Apocalypse, Logan, all of those are excellent movies, but none of them are decade best material. There's also Deadpool 2, which is kind of like Dark Knight Rises in the sense that it is not anything too new or interesting. It's good, but it doesn't quite do anything unprecedented. There are also some movies from the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, On Stranger Tides and Dead Men Tell No Tales. Both of those are really good, but they are not world beaters. They don't have quite the same sense of humor, even if the effects have been improved. There are some really good Transformers movies from this decade: Dark Side of the Moon, Age of Extinction, The Last Knight, and Bumblebee. Bumblebee is probably the best of these, but they all have a lot of merit and are worth watching despite some of the critiques you hear on the internet, which are unfounded. The Bounty Hunter, early in the decade, one of the few comedies. I guess comedy wasn't dead yet. This is also right before Jennifer Aniston hit the walls. This is like the last movie where Jennifer Aniston is still hot, so something to think about. Scott Pilgrim versus the World. This was another early on 2010s comedy, very unique and odd. It felt kind of like a 90s movie, kind of like Tank Girls and like that. Pretty cool, had great style and effects, looked like a contemporary video game. But I don't think that some of the humor will age well over time because it is very much decade-specific jokes. And also the girls having blue and pink hair and all that stuff is something that was very early 2010s and something that I think people in 10 years will think looks really stupid. Get Out. This is a movie I personally don't like, but it was very critically acclaimed and it has a big following. It really reshaped what horror movies are about, and it made them a lot less scary, and now they try to be all political, mostly like in a liberal way. Now, like I said, I hate the movie, but I do have to admit that it had a massive impact, so it's here. Another very liberal movie that I absolutely can't stand, but which was apparently good according to other people, The Shape of Water. I keep it out of the top 10, however, because it is one which doesn't make a ton of sense, and it could have used a lot more dialogue. They have a protagonist who doesn't speak, and I don't think that works. Green Lantern was a pretty good movie. At the time, people hated it, but I think over time, people will appreciate that it has the same kind of qualities that we see in the Transformers films that really make these movies stand out. Another great remake was Conan the Barbarian. It's right up there with Total Recall and Red Dawn. Jack and Jill, underrated comedy. Not Adam Sandler's best movie. It wasn't on the level of You Can't Mess with the Zohan or Billy Madison, but it was very solid. And like I said, the laughs in this decade were pretty few and far between, so it was much appreciated. And I think it will actually stand up to the test of time, even though it is out of place in the 2010s. A Good Day to Die Hard. It's always a good day for a Die Hard movie. 47 Ronin. This could have been a lot better if it had focused more on masculinity rather than on fancy sword moves, but it was still okay. Pompeii, really cool effects, really broke a lot of ground there. Had some historical value, but it was a little too effect heavy and didn't have quite enough in the way of dialogue. Saving Christmas, this was part of that conservative backlash I was talking about earlier, where conservatives were finally standing up for themselves against liberal Hollywood. The movie is very much dialogue driven. However, it could have used more events because it's basically more like a conversation between two guys about the meaning of Christmas, which works really well. But given that they had famous actors and theatrical releases, they could have done a little more. They probably had the money to do more. Left Behind, this is probably the most important movie Nicolas Cage has ever been in. It could have been a little better in certain ways, but it does tell the story of how the world will end, and it does so in a pretty compelling manner. Most of the acting is pretty solid, and it makes all of the characters much more relatable than in previous efforts at making Left Behind. Hot Tub Time Machine, Paul Blart Mall Cop 2. Like I said, while the decade was a little short on comedy, they did have some stuff to work with, and neither of these were sort of Hall of Fame comedies, but the decade as a whole was a little weak outside of action and superheroes, so I decided to put these in here just to vary up the list and not list like every action movie. Rambo Last Blood. I wouldn't say it's my favorite Rambo movie because it isn't, but it's not bad. And I think Stallone does a pretty good job of selling us on a very old guy who still has some juice left. The Avengers, the original, this really helped set the stage for a great series, and it brought together the Marvel Universe. The Hangover Part 2 and Part 3, these were both good, but they kind of didn't fit the times very well. These would have been excellent 80s or 90s comedy movies, and they're still good, and I personally like them a lot, but they don't really fit the 2010s well enough to be top 10 films from the decade. And I think that in 5 years, people will look back and probably not like these as much as they do now. So, now that we've determined what the honorable mentions are, let's get into the top 10 movies of the 2010s. Number 10, The Monuments Men. There weren't all that many great war movies in the 2010s, but there were a few that really stood out as being quite good. One of them, perhaps the earliest of the bunch, was actually Monuments Men in 2014. The focus of this movie is not on, say, commandos or paratroopers or sort of your normal badasses from World War II. Instead, it focuses on a group of art nerds who were not soldiers, but then they enlisted in order to go over to Europe and try to save art from Nazis. These guys are kind of old and fat, and they're also nerds. At least one of them is gay. The reason they fought was not because they're good at fighting, but because they have a passion and they believe in art and they love America and freedom. And I think that this is something which really shows that even nerds can be patriotic, potentially. So this is something that kind of reaches out to the left. And this kind of fits into the decade because it was mostly the right trying to unify the country and then people on the left under Obama being very divisive. This was kind of a reach out to the people on the left saying, you too can make this country better if only you will embrace the principles of this country. Monuments Men is a story of redemption, patriotism, and duty. It's a forgotten, overlooked chapter in World War II history, and just by that virtue alone, I think this is something that will stand the test of time relatively well. Number 9, Avengers Endgame. This movie is quite simply epic, as it was designed to be. It's the epic conclusion to an epic series about the fate of the universe. It defines what it is to be epic. Now, beyond that, it perhaps is not as good or as well developed as even some of the movies that only made the honorable mentions. However, one thing it pulls off that even Lord of the Rings Return of the King failed to do is an epic ending. In Return of the King, as I mentioned last time, the problem is that the CG was total ass, even by the standards of the day. They could have done better on a PS2, and that kind of takes away from what they're trying to show. By the time they made Avengers Endgame, which was just last year, they nailed it. They had the technology right on point, and everything looked fantastic. Endgame ties up a whole lot of loose ends. This movie franchise got really complex, had a lot of characters and moving parts, and it brought it together. This was as good or better than Game of Thrones Season 8 at bringing things together at the end. Endgame doesn't sugarcoat the cost of saving the universe. I like that many of the characters die for this glorious cause. And I think that that really shows a kind of realism, even though we're talking about superheroes fighting for the fate of the universe, it still brings home the cost of what happened. So I think that this one has a fittingly serious tone after many of the earlier ones were a little bit lighthearted. So it really adds to the epicness on display. Number 8, Deadpool. In a decade where superhero movies were always available pretty much every 2 to 3 months at the minimum, if you didn't like superheroes, it probably kind of sucked. However, there was a movie for even such people who don't understand things that are cool, and that movie was Deadpool. And it's such a good anti-superhero movie that it's also awesome even if you do like superheroes. So it kind of works for everyone in a different way. This is basically what is it like to be a B-rate superhero, somebody who wouldn't be an Avenger, somebody who's not really accomplishing anything of note, has a kind of snarky sense of humor, and then has to be looked after by other B-rate superheroes who can't really get the job done in real. Because you think about it, like if you had a bunch of superheroes, some of them would kind of suck or be below average, and that's basically what Deadpool's about. So it expands the Marvel Universe in new and interesting ways, and it's the only truly funny comedy of the SJW decade. It's the one that I think in 10 years people could still watch it and laugh and say, man, that one was pretty good. They should make a Deadpool 3. Also, what Deadpool allows us to do is forgive and forget other movies that had Ryan Reynolds in them. So this was really a turning point for Ryan Reynolds. Before that, he was mostly known for Van Wilder and some other movies that really kind of sucked. And he was getting kind of old to play like a college loser. So this kind of was big for him too, and he'll probably be around for a while longer. So I imagine a lot of his movies will appear in the next decade, and he has this movie to thank for that. Number 7, Taken 2. This one basically takes what the original movie did and builds on it in a way that's both believable and expands upon what happened before. This is the peak of a great action series. It begins and ends pretty good, but in the middle is where it really hits its stride. Taken 2 is also important in the post 9/11 world because it really shows the danger of travel to Muslim countries. Basically, you shouldn't travel to countries where 50+% of the country is Muslim. Point blank, period. It's a story of revenge and high stakes, and it works really well. It's like a poker game, but with guns. It's a complex world. The story is complex. There's a lot of moving parts, but it's clearly told, and I think that's what will make this one a classic. If you had to show someone any Taken movie in order to tell them about what the series is like, I recommend showing them this one. This is Taken at its finest. Number 6, one that may have slipped under your radar, Maximum Conviction. This is an action movie featuring the duo of Steven Seagal and Stone Cold Steve Austin. Both of them play sort of federal wardens or mercenaries who are transporting prisoners. Both of them have guns, and both of them fight hand to hand. So in other words, I'm telling you, this is a gritty action movie that kicks ass. And this is easily the manliest movie of the decade. And since this was very much the SJW decade, even despite all the superhero stuff, it was a much needed shot of testosterone for the country as a whole. It's really unfortunate that more people weren't able to see this one, but I recommend checking it out immediately if you're a guy and you need to see men being men kicking ass. Number 5, God's Not Dead. This is a film which successfully represents what it's like to be part of a persecuted minority, that is to be a Christian in America under Obama, and it really popularized Christian films. Before this, people were just making Christian films, and they were only being seen by other Christians. This one really got a lot of acclaim, and a lot of secularists and leftists had to actually respond to this one and pretend that it sucked in order to try to discredit it. But as you see from the growth of the Christian film industry, clearly it didn't. It's the story of a young college student having to battle his professor on the issue of whether God is real or not. And it's really a great, gripping story. It does a great job of showing what it's actually like to be in an American college town or to be a person of faith dealing with professors. It also really does a good job of showing town versus gown tension, how all the locals always hate the douchebag professors who live in their towns. And it also is really good for community building, so it's something that you can show to teenagers who are about to go off to college, and it gives them an idea of what to expect. And as someone who always has truth with a truth-flavored bias, this movie basically delivers truth with a truth-flavored bias, and I have to give my hat off to that. This is just incredible work, and it's the Lord's work as well, so this is good all the way around. I regret I can't put it a little higher, but it doesn't really have some of the high-end effects or things of that nature that would make a movie truly great. It is very good, though. I imagine it will be replaced by something a little better, a little glossier at some point that will hold up better over time. Number 4 is the fourth of the James Bond movies starring Daniel Craig. In the previous movies, he was kind of a brooding, depressed Bond who was physically breaking down during the second and third movies. By the time we get to the fourth movie, however, it seems like Bond has kind of settled in and accepted who he is and what has happened to him. He's kind of resigned to live in the world, but also have some fun along the way. It is, in my opinion, the most realistic Bond and also the most likable. It combines the grit of the Craig era with the goofy fun of the Connery era, and this is a combination which is immensely amazing. It was a much needed fun spy romp at a time of uncertainty due to the weakness of President Mom Jeans and his kowtowing the foreign leaders. A lot of people on TV were very serious sounding, and they also sounded like they were worried that America wouldn't be able to keep its place in the world. But then you have a Western hero like James Bond, walking around in clubs, picking up women, and doing amazing things. And it just really reassured people, I think, and let them know that America and Britain are still strong and still leading the world. Number 3, Suicide Squad. This is one that unfortunately most people don't get. It's even more misunderstood than the Meg. Suicide Squad was not trying to be funny, unlike the Meg, but what it is doing is trying to create a new way of storytelling altogether. It has a different narrative style which does not work the same way as other movies because it works much better. Suicide Squad works like a book rather than like most movies. It is something that unless you are an intelligent viewer who is on the up and up and keeps track of all of the different plot points, you're not going to be able to get a lot out of it. However, if you are a viewer who's very attentive, and if you're someone who watches movies closely like I do, and you always look for how the threads fit together, then you will love Suicide Squad. So that's why this movie is so divisive, because there are people who know how to watch movies, and there are people who are stupid. Now, the story here is a story of bad guys from their own perspective, but also not being sympathetic to them or glorifying them. It strikes the perfect balance because we should understand the bad guys, but we shouldn't ever think that they're good or feel any pity for them. If you have the chance to kill the bad guys, you kill them. But that doesn't mean that you can't learn about their story. And I think Suicide Squad nails that. Another thing that's really good here that I think doesn't get appreciated is that there is great chemistry among the various characters. And yes, that includes Jared Leto's Joker. We have to remember that this is showing us a slice of life from the perspective of the bad guys. They're not going to go out of their way to try to impress each other. Again, these are all bad guys who are coming out of prison. And we have to remember that the love between Harley Quinn and Joker only makes sense if both of them are pretty much insane. Speaking of Harley Quinn, this was her film debut, and it looks like this is going to launch into a major series. Birds of Prey is out in theaters now. Apparently, it's really awesome. I haven't seen it yet. And yeah, this was also a great career move for Margot Robbie, who after this movie became very famous and started appearing in a lot of stuff, which is awesome. Although I think she should be contractually obligated to always wear short shorts in every film. Number 2, getting into the nitty-gritty, we have Midway. Now, this is one hell of a war movie. I would call it incredible, easily the best of the decade. Some people are fans of Dunkirk in 1917, but aside from being lousy with too many limeys, those movies just don't really tell a story very well. They're not that educational, and they also don't promote a love of country the way that a good war movie should. Midway, however, is fucking brilliant. First of all, the effects are mind-blowing. This is amazingly done to the point where you feel like you're there even if you didn't watch it in 3D. And this makes me once again angry that movies have abandoned the real resolution of film and 4:3 screen size. Because if we could see this the way that it was meant to be viewed, it would really be astounding. This would be something that would really just define people's lives watching this movie. So like I said, Midway promotes a love of country, and I also have to give it credit for showing that the Japanese, even though they were evil, were also capable of being brave. That the Japanese who decided to die on their ships or to kamikaze themselves or to bomb Pearl Harbor, that these men were taking immense risk and that they were fighting their damnedest. And that makes it all the more impressive when the Americans were able to defeat them and, be better than them and kill them. So Midway is also something that I think should be required viewing in American classrooms. This is something that teaches history and is very educational. So if you haven't seen this movie for whatever reason, you need to watch it immediately. Midway is a movie that's good enough to last forever. I don't think Midway will ever be displaced as one of, if not the greatest war movies of all time. However, when it came to the greatest movie of the decade, it was not a hard choice. The best movie of the 2010s by a long shot, the best superhero movie in a decade of superhero movies, and the best conservative film of all time is Aquaman. Aquaman has the best special effects in a decade that has many movies with amazing effects. It has the best storytelling. It's even more intricate and well told than Suicide Squad. World building here is brilliant. You meet all kinds of little civilizations. It mixes mythology and history. It really just integrates everything really well. And the cast is phenomenal. You have Nicole Kidman, you have all kinds of people in this movie. And you also have the guy who plays Aquaman, who not only played Drogo in Game of Thrones, but also is the starting center of the Oklahoma City Thunder. Just amazing film, and it really summarizes everything that is potentially good about the last decade. It's a story of good versus evil, and it's the story of a new king arising to deal with all the bullshit of the past. Aquaman was basically the Trump of his universe, and I think that it's very clear that this is the intention of the movie. Aquaman is so good, both in terms of absolute terms and subjective terms for being part of the 2010s, that I think that it has a real shot of being the best movie of all time. There are a few movies I'll have to rewatch to make sure that Aquaman beats them out, but right now it's pretty much between Aquaman, Citizen Kane, and Casablanca in terms of being the GOAT movie. And I'm pretty sure Aquaman is better than those. This is another time, however, when I do have to say that I'm also very upset that this is not available on proper film and that it can't be displayed very well in 4:3. Because if it was in 4:3, its true native screen size, this would be mind-blowingly beautiful, especially all the scenes with the hot redheaded chick. I'm Remarkable Republican, bringing you the truth with a truth-flavored bias, signing out.